My name is Sharon Morris, and I'm the Public Library Leadership Consultant at the Colorado State Library, which is a unit of the Colorado Department of Education. I'm joined here by my colleague, Kieran Hickson, who's the Rural and Small Library Consultant, and our work involves supporting libraries with strategic initiatives that strengthen them in their communities. And to this end, we are supporting these amazing Colorado Public Library directors as they bring you this series of hands-on workshops. So before we hand it over to them, Karen, what excites you about this series?
Well, I like the process for a couple reasons. And one of the reasons is it works for libraries of all sizes, small and big. And there's not a big budget that you need. And it's a really flexible framework, really. And the results that I've seen from small libraries that have tried the process is, they get at what the community perceives and needs, and it works. So, yeah, that's
Yeah,
what I like about it.
it's so true. We've seen such powerful responses that people have. So let's just look at where we're at here. We've got a three-part series here, and today's session is about developing the plan. First, I want to introduce you to our amazing Colorado Public Library directors who are going to be presenting what they've been doing and inspiring you with them. So Nancy Trim comes to us from the Bemis Public Library in Littleton, Colorado. Brenda Marshall is down in Southwest Colorado at the Pine River Library District in Bayfield. And Jamie LaRue hails from Western Colorado at the Garfield County Public Library District in Rifle. So welcome, and Nancy, would you like to take it over?
Thank you, Sharon, and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. I just want to talk a little bit about how we started this process and why. Bemis Library began its strategic planning process at the beginning of 2021, and we hired Jamie to lead us through this planning process, which includes this outward-facing community interview process. And at the time when we started, we were really struggling as an organization due to COVID-related staffing and funding cuts. During that time, our staffing was cut by 30%. Our funding was cut by 20%. And the library was operating at 60% of its pre-COVID hours. So we were really feeling isolated and cut off from our community due to the pandemic and our diminished staffing and hours. We undertook the community conversation process at this time for several reasons. We recently had a leadership reorganization within our library. We felt like we needed a way to focus on moving forward, both because of the reorganization and also because of the ramifications of the pandemic. And we really wanted to start planning for a brighter future. We wanted to have something to look forward to and to rebuild those really crucial community relationships. We wanted to understand what our community's concerns were, and then as a result of the interviews that we conducted, really identify how we could add our value to the community. And Brenda, on to you.
Thanks, Nancy. Yeah, I'm Brenda Marshall. I'm the director of Pine River Public Library. We're down in Southwest Colorado in between Durango and Pagosa. And I was hired as director during the pandemic, and but I'd been assistant director here for a few years. And we had gone out for a mill levy in 2018, and we lost our bid for the mill levy. And then we went back to our community in 2019, and we did receive our mill levy increase. And at that point, so we got that money, we got that approval at the very end of 2019, and 2020 we were ready to go, with big ideas and big plans and what have you. And then, of course, we hit the pandemic, and everything sort of screeched to a halt for a while. So then I was hired at the start of 2021 and had the remit from the board to look at a strategic plan. Meanwhile, I was kind of floundering as a new director, trying to get my feet under me and not sure where to start, pretty overwhelmed at this concept. And so we, after a few months, reached out to Jamie and started thinking about how to move ahead in this direction. And what I was really concerned about was that we'd had this sort of opportunity to pause and reset. And as a staff, we had loads of really good ideas about how to spend our money and how to allocate our budget and what to do. But we didn't want to take off with our good ideas without hearing what the community's good ideas were. And so we really, and we were very aware that although we'd received approval from the majority of the taxpayers, we had not received approval from a large portion of our taxpayers. So we wanted to make sure we were speaking to everybody in the community and not just the library people, that we were speaking to all sorts of people. And I had this remit from the board to go and look at what the community wanted. And then Jamie's process and framework that he'd put together was just really, it's really a simple framework, and it's really not intimidating. So that's why we decided to go with this framework, and I've really enjoyed the process and learned a lot from it. So I'm going to turn over to Jamie, and he's going to let you know a little bit more about that. Thanks, Jamie.
Okay. Well, thank you, Brenda. And I should say that when I first started doing this was about 10 years ago, when I was the director of the Douglas County Library District. And what precipitated that one is we were having a big discussion at that time about what was the role of a reference librarian. It was about that time that we did a study and found out that about 15% of the questions that came to the reference desk needed somebody with an MLS. 85% of them did not. And so our reference people were saying, do we still need reference librarians? And I was saying that at that time that I went to a lot of meetings. This is what library directors do. And one of the things I found was that in all of our communities in Douglas County, everybody was talking about how do you keep the downtown alive? And so I wound up sending off some reference librarians to work with external groups in the community. And after that, we said, this was very successful. And at about that time, a lot of this outward facing idea was starting to come forward in the profession. And instead of doing surveys or doing big focus groups, we said, can we just build a community? Can we catalog the community by using reference interviews? Can we just do one-on-one references? And so as we started doing that, we found it to be very, very powerful. Over the next several years, when I became a library consultant, I was just really intrigued by that notion as a way to become more visible, to build relationships with people in the community. And I was happy enough to find many libraries who were interested in this kind of a process, and found that most of my consulting during the period of the pandemic was about community engagement. It was all based on these kinds of community-based interviews, and I found it to be a lot of fun. And so I'm just delighted to kind of share some of this to people, because it's a very simple kind of a process. And I will be launching this one again in Garfield County now. So if I can just kind of toss this back again to our speakers here. All of you, you're kind of in different phases with this. I know that Bemis has already gone through the process. And so I'll start again with you, Nancy. I wonder if you can just talk about what kinds of uses have you made of all of these community interviews? And then I'll come back and ask Brenda, who I think is still in process. So Nancy.
Sure, thanks, Jamie. For us, the community conversation process was an opportunity to do strategic planning. We were really in pretty dire need of a clear strategic plan, a roadmap for our future. Additionally, it was a good opportunity for staff development, really for leadership development, for staff to feel comfortable doing outreach to our community and building relationships with stakeholders. So it was an opportunity to enhance skills, public speaking, critical communication skills, and really leadership skills. And then also it was a great opportunity for us to make key connections and form those relationships that have helped us in the time since really gain support and even some key advocates for our library.
Okay, and Brenda, how about you?
Yeah, I echo a lot of those sentiments. Our stated reason for going in was strategic planning, and that was, a huge focus for us. But we sort of byproducts and other things we were pretty intentional about was either building relationships and also repairing relationships. We did reach out to deliberately reached out to non-library people. We had one gentleman who we'd had a real broken relationship during the pandemic. He was very unhappy about our approach to the pandemic, and so I made a point of reaching out to him specifically to ask his opinion about our future, to reach out and find out his input, which was really incredibly helpful and wonderful to have an excuse to do that, to reach out. And with a lot of the people that we ended up speaking to, what I found was that I got to know a lot about what was going on in our town and to change the dynamic of our relationship. When you're in a small town like we are, and I've been here over 20 years, I have relationships with a lot of people where I know them in one capacity, but here we were able to center the library as a hub of listening, of hearing what was going on, collecting this information. And people were very receptive. They were happy that we were reaching out, asking what they thought about things rather than us reaching out asking for something from them, money or support or anything, So the relationship building was really center, and then also centering the library as a resource. And a byproduct was us being able to share. We were listening more than talking, but we were able to share a lot of what the library is offering, just sort of organically. Thank you.
Well, and again, what I want to point out is the process itself is very simple, and you'll see that on the next slide. But what I found with the maybe 10 libraries that I've worked through this with, everybody puts it to a different use. When I did this at Douglas County, one of the things we heard over and over was that there was a tremendous lack of civic engagement or civic understanding. That was one issue. And the other issue was there was a huge demographic shift. That 35 to 50 zone was turning into a 55 and plus. So a lot of people were retiring. And so what we wound up deciding to do as a way to address this community issue was to build a volunteer database. It was kind of predicated on dating software. Instead of having to go around to all the different websites to find out where you applied to be a volunteer, you went to one place, did a profile, and then all the civic organizations tried to date you, tried to recruit you as a volunteer. And we found that after we did that, 1 year later, we had 10,000 new volunteers in our community. So there was a huge payoff. So as I mentioned, those are three very different kind of approaches. But what I found from the maybe, as I say, 10 or so folks that I've worked through this process with, most people start off saying, we need a new plan, and we feel like we're losing some support in the community. We have to do a different kind of planning. Some people just said, we feel like things are changing in our community. We want to do an environmental scan. In Arizona, there was one library director who was brand new, just started the job, and she said, I want to use this as a way to go around and introduce myself to some of the most powerful people in the community. That's what she used it for. Her neighbor was kind of like Brenda, had been in the community for a long, long time, but she said, my staff, they're all new and they don't know the community. And I would like us to be able to have conversations that were not just about the library, but about what was happening in the community. And I wanted that to be shared knowledge. Brenda kind of touched on this thing about people were unhappy about how the pandemic was used or building some of these relationships. But one of the things that almost everybody found when they began doing this kind of community outreach and community interviews was everybody was desperately lonely. They were very isolated. And they were so thrilled to get a phone call from a friendly voice who wanted to know what they thought and who wanted to find out what they cared about. So it really was a powerful way for the library to step forward and say, one of our primary missions is to connect people. And then, as I mentioned with our project about volunteer databases, it allowed us to earn support from the community by demonstrating our value, not just by talking about it. It was a different kind of advocacy. So here's the slide that kind of goes through all of the steps. And so let me just walk through this. And again, Brenda and Nancy and Kieran, anybody, feel free to jump in if you have questions or comments about this. It all begins like this. In two different settings, one is with staff and one is with your board or your whatever your governing authority is. You just take a little bit of time to say, who are the movers and shakers? Who are the big influencers in our community? And we'll talk later about some different categories. And the second step is that you go to their place of business, was the original idea. You interview them, not in the library, but in a place where that's their seat of power, could be their office. In practice, what happened during the pandemic was it was done on Zoom, it was done on telephone calls, or in one case, in one of the Arizona libraries, they said, well, let's meet outside at the park. And they sat on opposite ends of a park bench and had the conversation. But the idea is it's not library centric. It's centered on the person that you're interviewing. Once you collect all those interviews and you have documented them, then the next stage is to go back and analyze them for themes. And what has happened in every one of these communities is after about 15, 20 people, the themes start to be congruent. They really converge. And then once you've done that analysis, and I found that typically it shakes out into about 5 to 7 very broad themes, then you reach out to all those people that you interviewed and you say, now we do want you to come to the library. And we want to tell you what you told us. We want to find out what we got right, what needs to be changed, and just make sure that we understand what the community is doing. And what I noticed when we did this every time was it went a profound shift happened in the minds of the community and in the minds of the librarians. Up until that point, they were exercising usual skills. They were just interviewing people and conducting these wonderful in-depth reference interviews. But when we called the meeting and all the powerful people in the community came in to find out what we had learned, suddenly we became leaders. Suddenly we were the ones that were helping to create, in some communities for the first time, a community agenda, a shared agenda. Very powerful. Once all that happened, then the library went back and said, okay, we've gotten some feedback about this, we revised it. Now it's time for us to pick a project, not just something that is library centric, something that advances our own goals, but something that moves the community forward, something that responds to those issues that the community raised. And so again, typically we would pick maybe 3 to 5 projects and say we had various tests for these, and we'll talk about these in upcoming sessions. But in brief, the idea is it has to fall in the library wheelhouse. If what people said is we want a pool hall, the library is probably not going to launch a pool hall. Or if they say that our issue is water, there's not something that the library can do to make more water. But we can certainly do things that pull together people who are water experts in the community. We can do demonstration community gardens. We can have all kinds of programs about ways to manage water use. And then we come back with this kind of new project initiatives, recommend that library or long-range plan to the board, get the money to do it, and then do them. And then the final thing that I always try to remind all the libraries I've worked with is don't forget them to go back to those movers and shakers and say, we did it. We asked you for your advice about the community. You helped us identify a need. We stepped up to be one of the community partners to address that issue, and it was successful. Let me just stop to look over here and say,
yeah, there's a few chat questions here that I know we're going to get into which stakeholders and brainstorming, and part of that has to do with what you're really trying to find out. But there are some questions about the looking at sort of the average person or less dominant voices, historically underserved groups, to add them to the inquiry. Do any of you all have thoughts about that right now before we kind of move to the next section?
I do actually. Brenna, I think that's a great point. And one of the beauties of this plan was that Brenna had asked about your average patron, whether to include them rather than just the movers and shakers. The beauty of this plan, I think, is that you have a lot of flexibility. So we had a very deliberate list that we put together of movers and shakers. When we got to the end of that, we looked very carefully to see who was missing. And then we went to we found those people. And then also I offered a couple of options that weren't in Jamie's plan, but they were helpful. First of all, I put out flyers everywhere, letting the patrons know we were doing a strategic plan and asking for them to give me input if they give us input if they wanted to. And a couple of those people we followed up with. And then also I held 2 open door community meetings, just where it was like, we're working on this, our planning. Would you like to participate in shaping the future of the library? And just had a couple of open houses. And I only had a few people come to each of them, but we did allow that input. I imagine there's a lot of other ways to do that, but there are a couple of ideas that we added in kind of late in the process.
Yeah, just a couple of quick comments about this too, is I know that many people, when they say, we have all this rich data that we collect all the time about library use, that tells us a great deal about the average patron, the average library user. What many libraries don't have, however, is relationships with people of power. And so this was a very low-key way in the process of gathering a lot of information. And also, one of the things I've learned, if somebody gets elected to office or somebody's the head of a not-for-profit, they think very deeply about an issue, and they've talked to lots and lots of people. So when I talk to somebody like that, a leader of an organization, I wind up not only getting their own thoughts, but the distilled thoughts of all the people that they talk to. It winds up being pretty effective. And I'm sorry, Nancy, it looks like you demuted yourself there for a moment. Did you have a comment?
Well, I was just going to speak to reaching out to historically underrepresented voices. I mean, we did make a conscious effort to include on our list people who may be generally sometimes socially excluded, and looked at our community demographics. In particular, for our community, we have a blind community here. The Colorado Center for the Blind is here. So we reached out to a couple people in that organization. We also have an immigrant resource center here. And so we reached out to the immigrant community, the Hispanic community, and members of the LGBT community, in particular, an organization in the Littleton area. And also we made a point to reach out to several teens. So we were really intentional about making sure that we had a diverse representation of voices on our movers and shakers list as well.
Okay, I think we'll address some of these other issues again moving forward. So again, today you saw the big view of what it is that we're trying to, all the different stages of it. So today we're focusing on just how you get ready to launch this, what kind of steps you need to take as an organization to conduct community reference interviews. So let me begin with this first one, is that what kind of questions do you think people have? So before you can get approval, blessing on the part of your organization to proceed, you kind of have to get some buy-in from your board. You have to get some buy-in from your staff, and you may well be asked, why are you doing this by the community? So again, I'll toss this open to Brenda and Nancy. Who pushed back? What kind of resistance did you receive from any of these stakeholders? What did they ask, and how did you respond to them? So Brenda, I'll call on you. You're higher on my screen.
Okay. Like I mentioned earlier, this was a remit that the board had, or many boards have as part of their job, is to look out for the long-term future of the library. And so I think really it's a pretty easy sell to a board from my perspective. Maybe I'm incorrect. So that wasn't an issue for us, but it might be for other people. Staff and the community, I think really, as long as we present it as mainly a listening project, that's a lot less threatening than what many of us might imagine. Really, the whole point of this is that we're listening a lot more than we're speaking, which is really hard for people like me who talk a lot. But and then what we started off by asking our staff the questions and collecting information from them and letting them practice with that sort of listening exercise. And so staff were excited really to hear what people wanted to say and wanted to know what was going on. And then, like I say, with the community, people sometimes were suspicious, like, what do you want from me? Why are you bugging me? Why are you reaching out to me? But once they realized that our agenda was to hear and not to preach, and to ask their input, then they were excited, and or they warmed up. And we noticed with a lot of people that they would start the interview with us assuming it was very different than it was, that they came in and it was like they thought they had to do homework and had some things they had to tell us. But as the interview went on, and we did do almost all of ours face to face, as that time went on, they relaxed and slowed down, and we got to hear a lot more about who they were. And we didn't get pushback. We did hear some complaints, and we did hear some stuff that was hard to hear. It wasn't all easy listening like that, but we didn't have pushback about the process, actually. I think it's a gentle and attractive process to most people who are on the other side of it. I'll hand over to you, Nancy.
Did you get pushback from anybody, from any of these groups?
Not necessarily pushback, but I think that we did work to manage a level of discomfort and maybe a lack of confidence that some of our staff had about conducting these interviews. And for us, having our staff work together in teams of 2 was really essential. I mean, it's important for the interview process itself, but it was also helpful for just confidence building. And we, as a leadership team, were really intentional about the staff that we paired together. We wanted to make sure that their strengths were complementary and their communication styles were complementary to one another. So we were really intentional about who we paired up, so that there was even an opportunity in some cases for a mentor-mentee relationship among staff.
Oh, that's clever. When we were doing this in Douglas County, the greatest resistance that I had was from the staff. My reference librarians, even though they said, we're looking for what's the next big thing, they felt very uncomfortable about leaving the building. So buddying up, going out as pairs help. But every single one of them came back enthused. One of the things that feeds all of us that are in library land is we like the feeling of helping. And what all my reference librarians were saying when they came back was, now it's not just helping an individual, it's helping a whole community. There's something we can do for all these people we talk to. The other thing that they all described that I found was fascinating, as we'll see when we get into the questions, one of the questions is, what's your personal passion? What drives you? And people would get really excited and they would start talking and they'd be, overflowing with enthusiasm. And then they would stop and look at the staff and they would say, I'm sorry, who are you again? Who are you from? And the staff would say, well, we're from the library. And the question was, and why are you doing this? And I think that so many people who are in positions of power and influence, they're used to folks coming to them to ask for money. And they never thought, you can see in that moment, they suddenly saw the library as an institution that wasn't asking for money, but was asking how they could help them achieve what mattered to them. And I think this, again, was not only building that powerful relationship with influencers, but it was kind of getting them to see the library not as a dependent, but as an asset, as a social asset at the table. Okay, let me jump on here to the next one. So this kind of addresses some of those questions about who do you identify to talk to? And Brenda, I'm going to come back and ask you this question too, is that I think often when we think about, we want to start surveying people, we begin from a library-centric standpoint. This shift, this idea about community planning, community interviews, is community-centric. So some of the categories that I would use to say, if that first stage is just make the list of all the people that should be interviewed, it was helpful for us to give names of categories. So under business, who are the main employers or activists within the business community? If you don't know that, or your board doesn't know that, start at the Chamber of Commerce and say, who are some of your players? All kinds of research is available about who the big employers are. Civic organizations. Every community has groups like the Rotary Optimist or the Lions, and they tend to be pretty chatty themselves. In education, who are the prominent leaders? And I'm talking about the principals, superintendents, could be the Board of Education, who's in charge of communication for the district. Elected officials, and I kind of noticed that it's not first. Well, it's alphabetical because I'm a librarian, but elected officials means that We often think they're the ones who make the decisions. But I'm not saying that you start by talking with just the elected officials. They're not often the ones who have the best insight into the community, but you certainly need to be thoughtful about who you should talk to. Often overlooked are the faith-based, who are the leaders of the larger, bigger churches, synagogues, mosques, any other houses of worship. And I found that some of the best information I've gotten was from those. We talked to a Presbyterian minister one time who said that he thought the biggest issue in Douglas County was grief. And we said, how did you get to grief? And he says, well, I used to be a grief counselor. And in Douglas County, which grew so rapidly, nobody was from there and everybody missed their home. And so one of the deep kinds of insights that I don't think you get from surveys or focus groups was this guy reflecting on his experience to say what people in this community is, they lack connections. They are grieving a loss of home. In government, who are the non-elected or appointed officials who actually get things done, I found one of our most powerful sources for interviews was talking to people who are in the media. Interview somebody who writes for the local newspaper. They're used to interviewing other people, but just because they've talked to so many people, they have lots of ideas. They have lots of reflections of their own. Very powerful group to talk to. Not-for-profit was one of the other big ones. I found that in almost every community now, particularly mid-pandemic and afterwards, a lot of folks lost their jobs and they said, I'm going to launch my own. I'm going to stop working for somebody. I'm going to do something that I care about. And so they have many kinds of deep insights into often social problems and very connected and thoughtful people. And then kind of going back to the point that I think Jeffrey or someone had made earlier, who always gets left out? And so again, not just talking about library patrons, because we have statistics for that. But when I was launching this process during the pandemic, it was also the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so many of the communities I were talking to, they said, no, we've identified all these people who are leaders, but what about the people who are on the edges of our community? How do we identify those? And Nancy talked about some ways to reach out. Brenda talked about making it available, putting up the flyers and trying to grab the attention of other people in the community. So any other additions to that from Brenda or Nancy? Any other groups that you found as particularly fruitful to talk to? Okay, moving on. So here's, as you begin to get organized, and this is something that only Brenda and Nancy can talk about because I really this was the piece that I handed over to them. I can give you some kind of general guidelines, but then we'll go back to the experts who actually did it. I found that it was always best to have at least 2 staff per interview. And one, it was kind of the buddy system. You got someone to support you. But the idea was basically one conducted the interview and the other one was recording it. They might step in and assist and, well, what about this? Or I didn't understand this point. But basically, one was there as a recorder. The big issue that determines how long it takes to complete this whole process is how many interviews can you do in a month. So typically most of the interviews we found lasted about 1 hour. 5 questions takes about 1 hour. And so if you're traveling off to their office, there's some travel time. And it depends upon the size of your library and the size of your staff. If you're a 1-person library, you're going to be recruiting the board. If you have more than one, it helps to send out some of the kind of frontline staff. And I've seen a tremendous variance in this. Some people who said, we have a lot of extra staff time right now when the library was closed. They could do a lot of interviews in a hurry. Nancy was the fastest of all the libraries I worked with. I think she completed all of her interviews in 6 weeks. Brenda was kind of, again, you saw changing it and thinking about ways to respond to things within the community. I think you've been at it for about a year now, but it's a rich process, right? You continue to learn things from it. And Brenda, I think you had asked about, should you involve board members in this? And my general advice is not, because I think one of the things I learned about this is you definitely want them there at the debrief. You want them to be thinking about this for the long range plan and to advocate for it. But I found that this was such a powerful tool to grow staff expertise that I tended to want to keep it there. Again, if you need interviewers, and you may have to lean on your board. And then I think the other thing that we did, and this was where I stepped back in as a consultant, was to say, let's keep it on schedule. There need to be some sort of regular schedule of management meetings. So Brenda and Nancy, how did you pick your team? How did you decide who was going to be your front people for this process? So Nancy, we'll start with you this time.
Sure. So First, I went to our leadership team, the group of supervisors that we had. And we had already been talking about the need for a strategic plan and a process. And so it was not hard to get them on board. They were excited about it. And quite frankly, because of the timing of our process, so many of us were, aching for community connection. And then the other group that I reached out to is our Directors Council. This is a council that I formed when I became director, and it's it's a group of 7 people that represents every department in our library. And we get together on a monthly basis for a year. And they're sort of, they're the people that I try out ideas on and get feedback on and feedback from. And then, they help me with buy-in and engagement and communication and roll out new initiatives or problem solve. And so that group, they were really my tool to recruit their colleagues. And so because they all already were leadership minded, they chose to participate on Directors Council. So they were already really engaged in being library leaders at whatever level they are at in the organization. So then I recruited them, and they did a great job of recruiting and getting their colleagues excited about participating. So we ended up with 16 staff in total, so 8 teams of 2. And I will say, we were unique because we did conduct our interviews really fast. We had around 40, maybe a couple more, 40 plus interviews in 6 weeks. However, you'll have to remember we were operating at reduced hours, reduced programming. So for us, it was almost like the perfect storm where we had the time to really commit to doing these interviews. And the other thing that was such a wonderful outcome was that after the first couple of teams went out, they came back and were so excited and enthusiastic about the process and the connections that they made and what they heard, that it was infectious. And so it really motivated the rest of the teams to get out, to make the connections, to make the phone calls, to set up the interviews. And then we would check in. Every week, actually. We met every other week, but we would at least do an email check-in. And we always looked at the spreadsheet to see, we had a spreadsheet that tracked when we made initial connection to set up the interview, when it was scheduled for. So we were tracking all that on a spreadsheet as well. And when interviews were scheduled for. So that's how we managed the project at Bemis. How about for you, Brenda?
We did it a little differently. One of the things that I kind of wanted to do as a new director is I did want to participate in most of the interviews if I could, because it felt like a really good way to get a good understanding of our community and to introduce myself to these different people. And I worked closely when we first started and we did our staff kind of training on it. I asked who would like to participate in the on the kind of team, and actually only had a couple of people that really wanted to do that. Everybody was interested to know what came up, but I didn't have people knocking on the door wanting to do it really. And I ended up doing most of the interviews with our cataloguing and acquisition manager, Lydia, who was just an amazing teammate to do that with. And then I did delegate a few of them. So there were a few where I knew the person very well personally. And I felt like if I interviewed them, I would just be in an echo chamber, and that they knew me well enough to just be telling me what I wanted to hear, or, we were like too close for comfort. And so people that I felt in the community were like that. Our assistant director interviewed a different pair, interviewed those people so that I wasn't just hearing what I wanted to hear. We did do it face to face, and I did have a board member that wanted to be more involved. But what we actually did with the board was we we brainstormed together our spreadsheet of people we wanted to interview. And then I went back to the board and I asked them to help us whittle that list down and to highlight people they felt were really important. So that was how I included them more, was who's missing from my list, who do you think is the most vital to talk to. And a couple of board members, I asked them to make the introduction for me. So please will you, if you know this person, please will you introduce me? So that's how we kind of managed that. And then, like I say, we really took our time. It's taken us over a year to do it. So I kind of laugh that Nancy was the fastest and we're probably on the slowest end of the spectrum. We decided we didn't really need to have a short deadline. We are wrapping up now. I'm happy to tell you, Jamie, we actually have our initiatives and we are getting to the end. But we gave ourselves that whole year, the whole of 2021, to do it, and we're starting the new year with our initiatives. So we did check in regularly. The other great thing about having a second person to write notes, is that during the interview, you are actually really present and making eye contact. And there were a couple that I had to do because of logistics where I was writing my own notes, only a couple. And that person I felt like was seeing the top of my head, or I was engaged in the conversation and afterwards I couldn't remember everything. So I highly recommend that, having a recorder. Yeah, thanks.
I was going to say that at Douglas County, because this arose as a question about what's the future of reference, it was kind of a reference department across all of our branches. We said we send out cadres of reference librarians. I think that worked really well, but obviously, again, it depends upon the size of your staff. In my case, I decided that I didn't want to be involved in many of these interviews because at that time I was very visible as the face of the library. And I thought it was probably wise to get lots of faces to the library. So when people thought about that, they knew somebody at their local connection instead of it just being a connection to the leadership. Okay, I wanted to move on to, often then people will ask you questions about the interviews. And staff always will say, okay, we need a little practice on this one. And so we put together something that I thought was very simple. It was like, we would take this kind of group, and this will be your key assignment after the interview. I'm not going to ask you to do this now, but the idea is that you pair up your staff and you ask them to interview each other. So these are the 3 questions. You give them only about 5 minutes, and then you say switch. And then after they do that, then you say, okay, now each of you stand up and debrief what you heard from the other person. And what I found is that, and I also think this kind of exercise may be worth repeating with the board, it lets people know what the process feels like. And it also teaches your staff that you don't require a lot of training. This is pretty basic. All you're doing is you're asking deep questions and giving people a chance to respond. And they get very engaged very quickly. One of the things that I always point out is that this process is all about just what Brenda was talking about. It's eye contact and engagement, and you are trying to be present. And it winds up being a very powerful promotion for the library to have somebody who's just listening and hanging on every word. So the 3 questions that we do for this is to say, what are the biggest issues facing your community? And by that, I mean the one you live in, not you work in. And we are not asking people to describe what library issues are, unless that's what everybody in the community is talking about. You're saying, what do you know or care about that's happening in your community? That second one is, what are your personal passions or interests? And again, this really perks up the person who's being interviewed. And then finally, we ask them, what movers and shakers do you personally know in your community who are not elected officials? And again, this was one of the ways to begin to get people thinking about, how do I identify the influencers? Okay, do I have anything to ask about that? Any comments from our other panelists about this? Just as training, I think the point of this one is it didn't take a lot of training. Okay, I'm gonna keep moving. So these are the 5 questions that I have kind of figured out that I think are the right ones to ask. And in kind of anticipation of questions coming out on chat, what I always say to people is you're shooting for 25 to 50 interviews. In some communities, after about 15, they got so much consistency and convergence of the answers. They said, I don't think we need to talk to any more movers and shakers. We need to talk to people who are outside of that, because we're not learning any new information. But the questions were these. You begin by saying, tell me how you got here. What's your story? And the one that I learned about this one, this is very much relationship building, and it's looking for ways to find connections with people. I found out when I was talking to, somebody, one of my preliminary interviews, they were born in the same hospital in the same town that I was born in. Just a nice little human connection. The second one, again, is what's your personal passion or driver? What's the thing that you care about? This is a good one to have very early on in the interview because it perks them up. People want to talk about the things that they love. And so again, you're bonding over the thing that they care about. The third one is the one that drives most of the content. As you think about your constituents, what are the issues that you think most matter to them over the next 18 to 24 months? And again, we're not saying, what do you think is most important? But as you think about the people you talk to, what do you hear them talking about? We're looking for some wisdom. We're looking for people who have deep knowledge about the community based on all of their conversations. The 18 to 24 months thing is just to introduce a little bit of urgency, not to say this is, what's going to happen in 50 years, but what do you think is really going to be emerging as an issue? And then fourth, to kind of tie this back, and I stole this flat out from a lot of the Harwood Institute stuff, is to say, what are your aspirations for the community? What you hope you get out of this? And again, it helps them kind of bring it back to say, well, we want to head in this direction. And that's very helpful for that notion of building an agenda. You're not just solving problems, you're building capacity. And then this last one is the one that I think Brenda or Nancy touched on as well. Often you finish this, you say, who else should we talk to? And you hear about a name that wasn't on anybody's list. There is some quiet, insightful person in a community who may be driving a lot of the efforts or initiatives that are happening. So I'll kind of stop and say, any comments about that?
A couple questions here too,
Okay.
about the using volunteers and to what extent people have done that.
Yeah, we didn't, for us it was staff, but again, I would say that very much depends upon the capacity of your staff. Do you have the ability to send people out? Nancy?
We did not use volunteers either, no.
And Brenda, no. But again, if you're a one-person library, you're going to need volunteers.
Mhm. And maybe perhaps looking to friends of the library in that case might be a good resource for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and were there other questions that came up, Karen or? Sure.
Another question that I saw earlier was just about how you decide how many. So the question was for Brenda, which she answered in the chat about how big her community is and how many people she talked with. And Nancy, it'd be good to hear the size of your community, how many you talked with, and how you each, decided how many was enough.
Yeah, we have a much bigger community. I mean, we're around 47,000, but we did, I think our list, we brainstormed almost 70 people, interviewed a little over 40. And quite frankly, like Jamie said, it did feel like enough because we started to see a pattern and emerging themes. And we felt like we did a good job of getting a good cross section of our community that even though we're larger, it felt like it was still a deep dive for us. And I'll just say that the question about who else to talk to was really a fruitful one for us. We uncovered several really valuable people as a result of that and interviewed them. And plus just being able to call someone and say, oh, your colleague so-and-so says you're a mover and shaker and we should talk to you. I mean, that really sets you up for a good interview with that person, quite frankly. So it's also a good technique.
Okay. Let me move on then. So here's kind of, and we've run a little bit over an hour. I apologize if people had to jump out of here. But again, Sharon posted this document that has most all of the content here that we've talked about. The assignments for the next one, if you want to stick with us for the next session, is introduce this topic to board and staff, figure out what kind of, based on the comments you heard from us, how can you get some of their buy-in and support for this effort? And then brainstorm those movers and shakers with staff and board. Again, I find that the best way to do that is very much in person, whiteboard, flip charts, put that list of categories up there to remind them, hand markers to people to get them to stand up, talk to each other, go up and write the name of the person down, what organization they're attached to, and whether or not you have a personal contact with them. And I think, again, you begin to see that within the space of half an hour, 45 minutes, you can get that 35, 50 names. The next step is to say, start looking at your staff, do as Brenda suggested, find out who's interested. As Nancy suggested, who needs maybe a little bit of development or is ready for a mentor or mentoring relationship. Set up your team to find out who's ready to go. And then conduct that staff interview exercise. Easy one to do at one staff meet. It takes, as I say, if it's 5 minutes to do that, and the other maybe 15 minutes to debrief, then you just remind everybody, you know how to do this. And we're all pretty good about paying attention to what people say and debriefing from it. So other questions? Oh, and I wanted to say too, if I can go back for just a second, under this questions for community, almost all the time when I give this list to a library, they say, we want to ask one more. And I say, okay, as long as it is not, what can the library do for you? Because they don't know. And that's not what this is about. This is not a library-centric process. It is a community-centric process. It's our job to figure out what we should do to meet their needs. It's not their job to tell us. So again, there's our list for things to be done by the next meeting. And with that, I think it goes back to Sharon for comments.
Yeah, so just a reminder, you've made it through the first of the 3 sessions. Congratulations to you. Looking forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Same bat channel, well, a little bit different bat channel. We'll send you the new Zoom link for that session. Be sure to register for part 2. And in that one, we're going to be covering interview techniques, which is going to be super fun, give you an opportunity to actually practice interviewing through the Zoom application. And then please remember to put session 3 on your calendar for March 3rd, because of course you'll want to know, once you gather all this information, how you can analyze and use it. So we really have spaced these a few weeks apart and then a longer time frame between session 2 and 3, so that you'll actually roll up your sleeves and start doing the activities that we're suggesting here. So please springboard from here to action. And as you do so, we're going to put all of our contacts on the screen here, so that if you want to reach out to any of us with questions, you're welcome to. Any questions now? We have just about 4 more minutes left. If you have any other questions, and Tia, who is the Association of Colorado Association of Libraries president right now, works in the schools, and is really loving the questions and is thinking about how to adjust them to fit the school library. And so the question, or maybe the implied question in this, Jamie or Brenda or Nancy, is, do you think some of these methods could apply in other types of libraries, whether it's an academic library, school library, special libraries?
I really do. And I think the way to think of this is that it doesn't change the questions, I don't think. It just changes your notion of community. So if you're working at a college, or university, the community is the academia. And if you're working at a school, then the community is the district, and it's all of the students. But yeah, I think that they can very easily be adapted to other kinds of libraries. And I saw that there was a comment there too about Zoom. During, and as a way to record it, many of the libraries that I worked with did decide to do these interviews on Zoom, but I think it's still a good idea to have at least 2 people on that session, because the person who's conducting the interview on Zoom is again trying to pay attention to the person. And it's really wise to have somebody kind of going along and thinking about recording things as you go. Again, it just gives you 2 people to comb through the content. I think it makes it clearer. Anything else I missed there, Sharon?
No, I think you all covered it. I guess with our 3 minutes left, if each of you wants to do a brief summary of your thoughts about planning, any last minute tips that you'd like to give people about planning?
Nancy, how about you? Why don't you go first?
I think you know, for us, setting a timeline and clear metrics was really important, so that we could hold ourselves accountable to meeting our own goals. So I would recommend that. And again, for me, it was really important to be intentional about how we paired the staff. And so I would recommend giving thought to who you're pairing up together and how they can learn and benefit from that connection with one another, and how they can help each other grow professionally.
Brenda?
I think my main message that I would want people to take away is that if it feels intimidating or overwhelming, it really doesn't. It was a lot more fun, or doesn't need to. It was a lot more fun than I expected. It was much more enjoyable, and it was a lot less intimidating than it looked from when I was sitting where you might be sitting now. And one small comment about having a second person, the other benefit of that I felt was that it's kind of like I noticed that I heard what I wanted to hear. And several times, on several occasions, when my friend and I were chatting afterwards about what was said, she would bring out things that I hadn't heard. Honestly, it was kind of shocking to me. And I was like, oh, yeah, they did say that. Or I'd come out and, it's that sort of confirmation bias. I'd come out thinking, they said this thing that absolutely agrees with what I think. And then she would be like, did they though? So just throwing that out there. Yeah, good luck. And I hope you embrace it and enjoy it and ask questions. And yeah, it was a fun process, and it's exciting to see it roll out, I think. Yeah.
Well, thank you to Jamie, Brenda, and Nancy for all of your contributions today and wisdom. And we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.